Uh-oh.
Okay, there we go. All right, we had a little bit of a glitch. A little bit of a glitch today with computers, but I think we got everything working now. You can hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, okay. All righty, so maybe we'll give another minute to see if some more folks come on. Although I happen to like a small group, but I'm happy to.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh, what, you don't hear me now?
You're frozen. You're frozen, Rabbi.
Frozen. Any other suggestions?
We're in the gallery.
Okay, good.
Well, there's you, there's me.
You're frozen.
Oh,
Oh, well, I'll try. All right, am I still frozen?
No, now you're moving. Now we hear you clearly.
All right, my computer wasn't working. This is a different computer. We're just, this is the problem of the Zoom age. So just let me know when you're not hearing me and we'll figure, I'll just try to figure it out, okay?
Got it, dear.
hey,
Oh, just give me a thumbs up or something so I know that you're hearing me. Okay, great. All right, fantastic. Thank you. So thank you all for being here. I'm excited to be teaching you this evening. I just wanted to say that tonight's teaching, today is November 4th, which was my father's secular birthday. So I'm I'm dedicating our learning to him. Today would have been his 98th birthday. Unfortunately, he never saw even his 54th birthday. So, and it's also happened. So we're dedicating our learning to my father. And also it's Rosh Chodesh Kislev, which is really exciting because it's always nice to start new and have a new month. This is the month of Hanukkah, will be in a few weeks, the same week as Thanksgiving. So let's start together by saying the bracha that we always do when we learn together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, our Lord, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments and given us the mitzvah to study and engage with Torah. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I think I'm going to mute everyone, but please feel free to unmute yourself because I like when when there's feedback. Okay, so I'm going to mute everyone. And if you can't see me, I don't know, let's make this, if you can't hear me or something goes on, just start waving frantically and I'll know something's very wrong. Okay, thank
you
you.
know what? We're gonna have to.
Okay. All right, so the arc of the class is we're going to talk about Mussar. First of all, a number of you have asked me, they said they never heard of the word Mussar. So the word Mussar is a Hebrew word and it means teaching. Okay, and sometimes it's called Mussar. That's when it's there. It's Yiddish iteration, but Mussar, because the Hebrew language always has the accent on the last syllable, is what it's called in Hebrew. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the background of Mussar and the founder, who was Rabbi Israel Salander. And then we'll talk about the discipline of Mussar, which is really different from any other kind of learning that we've done before. And after we have some context, we will dive into today's Mussar class, which is about bitachon, which is trust. Because Mussar, as we'll see, has to deal with different traits. Next week, we're going to learn about the trait of savlanut, which means patience. On our third class, we'll talk about shmirat halashon, which is how we use speech. And the last class, which is the Monday before Thanksgiving, not surprisingly, we'll be talking about hakarat hatov, which is gratitude. So as I mentioned, and for people who just joined us, if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. I know we don't have a choice at this point about using the Zoom. I really miss being with all of you in person. I'd much rather be with you in person. I have a little bit of Zoom fatigue, and I think my computer had Zoom fatigue because my computer's microphone wasn't working at all, and now I'm using a different computer. Let's hope that the technology is going to work. So Mussar is best when it's interactive, when people share what they're thinking and what they're feeling. So let's try to improvise the in-person energy, and let's try to make this as interactive as possible by feeling free to use the unmute button. Okay, so the first source that I wanted to look at. Okay, this was the source that was in the blurb that I wrote. Which is a beautiful story that I love, which comes from the book Everyday Holiness, which I'll talk about in a little bit later. So when the Canadian member of Parliament, Chuck Cadman, died, a colleague came to pay his respects to Cadman's widow. The colleague praised Cadman lavishly, prompting the widow to say, Chuck saw himself as an ordinary person. Yes, responded the colleague, but he was an extraordinary ordinary person. And that's what Mussar actually helps us to become. Mussar helps us to become an extraordinary, ordinary person. So the founder of the Mussar movement, Rabbi Yester of Salander, lived in the 1800s from 1810 until 1883. And he was born on November 3rd, which means that yesterday he would have been 111, so a little bit older than my dad. And he was raised in a traditional rabbinic family in Lithuania. His father was a rabbi and a teacher. And the untraditional part of his upbringing is that his mother, Leah Lipkin, published works on the Bible and the Talmud. And his last name was actually Lipkin, but because he studied at the yeshiva in Salander, he took the last name Salander. His eldest son followed in his footsteps, became also a teacher of Mussar, and he had another son who became a well-known mathematician. His name was Yom Tov Lipman Lipkin. I was not familiar with him, but maybe there are some mathematicians here who are. So the Rabbi Salander was happy as being a rabbi and a teacher, and his forte was reaching out to Amcha. He felt that everybody, Amcha is the Yiddish and also the Hebrew word for the populace. Amcha means populace. He thought that everybody should be able to have a Jewish education, and maybe, and he's, especially if you didn't have a yeshiva education, he reached out to women and people who weren't lettered in Jewish texts, and all the people who were marginalized in the shtetls of the 1800s. He reached out to them, and he wanted them to be able to study and to learn. And he had plans for a modern translation of the Talmud into Yiddish. But that never happened. But that was his plan. He thought that everybody should be able to learn the Talmud, sort of like Rabbi Steinsaltz, who passed away recently, may he rest in peace, who put the Talmud which the Talmud is in Aramaic, he translated it into Hebrew so people could read it. So Rabbi Salander drew on the Mussar tradition, going back to biblical times. And his idea was that the tradition stressed how the Torah could teach us about our personal life. And it talked more about the spiritual meaning of observance, not just being concerned with the letter of the law. The spiritual and the behavioral side of Judaism was very important to him. And today we take this for granted because now we think of Judaism and we want our Judaism to be meaningful to us. We don't want it to be just something that's in the books or just something for the rabbis and the scholars. But in the 1800s in the shtetls in Europe, that was a novel idea. So, and his idea was also that the learning shouldn't just be in the Beit Midrash. It should be about living your lives and being able to change yourself. And this is illustrated by a beautiful story that no one knows who exactly it's about, but it's attributed to the Chafetz Chaim, who was a 20th century rabbi and scholar, whose magnum opus was called Guard Your Tongue, about not speaking Lashon Hara, not speaking, in ways that aren't kind. And we will learn about that book next week. So I'm just going to share with you the story. No, I didn't want that. No. Hit the wrong thing. Share screen. Okay. Can I get a volunteer to read the story about the Chafetz Chaim? Anybody can just unmute and read.
I'll read.
Thank you. Thank you, Rosalie.
When the Chafetz
Chaim. Yeah, the Chafetz Chaim means one who wants life, one who yearns for life.
When the Chafetz Chaim was asked how he became such an influential world leader, he replied, "I set out to change the world, but I failed. So I scaled back my efforts and tried to change only the Jewish community of Poland, but I failed there too. So I targeted my hometown of Radin, but achieved no success. Then I directed all my effort to changing my family and failed at that as well. Finally, I decided to change myself, and that's how I had such an impact on the Jewish world."
So that's the Chafetz Chaim's take on that, when you change yourself, you see things differently and the world becomes a different and a better place, or hopefully a better place. So Rabbi Salander's followers, many of him thought of him as a saint, and there were so many interesting stories. One is that it was Yom Kippur and during the cholera pandemic, and he told everybody who was suffering that they should eat and drink on Yom Kippur. And the way he did that, he didn't just tell people, but what he did was after Kol Nidre services on Yom Kippur Eve, he decided to make Kiddush, and then he ate and drank on the bima to show people that that was an important thing to do. What Kiddush he made, I don't know, because Yom Kippur is the one holiday that doesn't have a Kiddush, because we don't eat on Yom Kippur, but apparently that was the story. One of his other more popular stories and popular teachings is based on a real life encounter that he had with a shoemaker late one night. It was a slichot, the Saturday night before Rosh Hashanah, and he was going to shul and to services, and he felt that a tear in his shoe. So he was looking, it's late at night, he's looking for a shoemaker. So he saw a light burning in the distance, and he went over there and he saw it was a shoemaker who was working by candlelight. And he said, "Is it possible for you to fix my shoes?" So the shoemaker, like just a regular person, said to him, "As long as the candle is burning, it is still possible to repair." When Rabbi Salander heard this, he thought this was so wonderful. He ran to shul and he made a Dvar Torah right away on that, telling everybody on the Shabbat, on the Saturday night before Rosh Hashanah, that as long as you're still alive, it's still possible to repair your soul and to do teshuvah. So that was the kind of teaching that he liked to do. Not very esoteric, down to earth kind of teaching. So what exactly is Mussar? So Mussar appears in the second verse, the word appears in the second verse of the book of Proverbs of Mishlei, and it means instruction and discipline or conduct, which is why Mussar is part of the study of Jewish ethics. A lot of people have heard about Pirkei Avot, ethics of the fathers, and that's an example of early Mussar literature. It's about how to be rather than how to do, how to be a person rather than how to do all the particulars of the laws. So Mussar of Rabbi Salander stresses that the interpersonal mitzvot, the mitzvot that are between, about being kind and loving to one another, are as important in keeping of the ritual mitzvot, which was very novel at that time. And it's interesting also that the idea of the subconscious was very much a part of Mussar before it was popularized by Freud. In 1880, Rabbi Salander wrote about the outer versus the inner, the clear versus the dark, and processes what we refer to now as the conscious and the subconscious. But that was before Freud actually talked about any of this. He wrote that it's critical for a person to recognize what their subconscious motivations are in order to understand them. It's also thought that Rabbi Salander suffered from depression, and that could have been the motivating factor for the psychological underpinnings for his teachings. Interesting that Rav Nachman of Bratslav, another scholar whose teachings have a very psychological bent, also suffered from depression. So Rabbi Salander lived in the 1800s. So how did the modern Mussar movement gain its popularity, right? No, sort of like it was in Europe and it didn't really come over to the New World so easily, but now it's very popular. There's a Mussar Institute, there's the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. All of that is very popular now, certainly in the last 50 years. Judaism in the latter part of the 20th century was not concerned really with personal or spiritual growth. Sort of the collective Jewish post-Holocaust project was about assimilating into American society, creating communal institutions, and supporting the new state of Israel and recovering from the Holocaust. The inner, the spiritual life of the individual was basically eliminated from the Jewish agenda. And because of that gap, because Jews weren't being taught to care about or care for their souls, many Jews went searching in other directions. They went to other religions, especially Eastern religions, with their focus on meditation and yoga and self-help programs. So into this void came the rebirth of Mussar, defined as guidance for inner living. But this wisdom didn't come from popular culture. It came from Torah and from Torah's interpretations. So the starting point of Mussar is the teaching of the Torah Kedoshim Tihiyu, which is in Leviticus 19:2. You shall be holy. As we read in the first source about the Canadian member of parliament, Mussar's goal is to help us become an extraordinary, ordinary person, to become the best version of ourselves that we can be. When we are whole, shalem, and we are holy. As the Kotzker Rebbe taught, okay, it's good to be holy, but remember that you have to be a mensch first. And we do this by learning Torah and acquiring Torah. Learning Torah means, as we know, we read a text and we grasp its concepts, and acquiring Torah means living what we learn. So it's the difference sort of between learning about humility and leading a life as being a humble person. One well-known teacher of Mussar, Rav Elia Lopain, defines Mussar as making the heart feel what the intellect already understands. Mussar is the bridge between what we know and what our heart feels. So how do we acquire Torah? How do we get the Torah to go from our minds to our hearts? We do that through effort and through practice. We acquire Torah through the currency of practice. But the catch is, so by practice, by doing different traits, which we'll get into. So the catch is we're always in a battle with our Yetzer Hara, right? With our evil inclination, which is another way to say our worst selves. And so our best selves are being challenged every day by our worst selves. And this challenge is ongoing our whole lives. It's not as if we can conquer this Yetzer Hara and it's gone. It's always with us, which is why recovering addicts always have to struggle their whole lives with their addictions, because it's once something is in there, it's, we have these negative instincts that they just don't go away. There's a great story about Eliezer of Zikov, a Mussar teacher. So he remembers that when he was 6 years old, he was scolded by his father for doing some misdeed. And he said to his father, but I can't help it. My Yetzer Hara, my evil inclination tempted me. So his father said to him, well, you should learn from your Yetzer Hara. Learn how diligent your evil inclination is. It never quits. And yes, said the little boy, he said, but my Yetzer Hara has no Yetzer Hara. My evil inclination doesn't have its own evil inclination that's getting it to do bad, to tempt it. So let's look at how this works practically. The Torah teaches us something like v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You should act lovingly towards your neighbor. So we all know this teaching intellectually, but we have to acquire it. We have to make it go from our brain into our heart. We have to internalize it, assimilate it, and make it part of who we are and actually help us to fight our evil inclination. So is there anybody among us who doesn't want to treat others in a loving way? Of course we do, right? We're good people. We want to treat others in a loving way. But then we discover that something happens, like we want to be loving with people, but then we discover that we're feeling impatient towards them, right? I mean, does that ever happen to you? I know sometimes I get impatient with people, most of all with myself, okay? Or we want to be loving and we find that when we're talking to somebody, we're feeling judgmental towards them, right? So what we're thinking and what we're feeling are two different things. Or we try to be loving and we wind up doing what works best for us and not really doing what the other person needs. So each of these encounters with another person becomes a personal test for us. Right? We want to be loving, but we have these inclinations that are taking us in less than loving ways. And the study of Mussar is what helps us learn how to pass these tests. In the world of Mussar, each of us is given what's called a spiritual curriculum, right? Just like we have a curriculum at school, we are given a spiritual curriculum by God. And nothing brings that challenge into focus more than trying to act lovingly towards other people. So we study Mussar in order to work on ourselves. We study Mussar in order to work on ourselves. And actually, we don't study Mussar. What we're going to learn, what we're going to see is that we do Mussar. It's one thing to study, it's another thing to do. And Mussar is not a study. Mussar is a doing. And the hope is not so much that we will change, but at least we'll become aware of what it is that needs to be repaired in our souls. Like Mussar teaches us that if we don't do the work, we'll keep being tested over and over again. So how many times have we found ourselves in the same type of a situation over and over again? You wind up doing something that you really don't want to do again. Or you find yourself sometimes in a relationship, it could be with a partner, it could be with a spouse, it could be with a friend, and you feel like this doesn't feel like a good relationship for me. How did I get here again? Okay, so we think to ourselves, I've been here, wherever the here is, I've been here in this place before, and I didn't like it. So how did I wind up here again? How did I wind up back in this place again? That's the personal curriculum that Mussar helps us address. So Rabbi Salander and his students developed 4 components to Mussar. Okay, they set up a list of character traits and values needed to be a good human being: kindness, responsibility for others, patience, inner tranquility, self-criticism, perseverance, watching your speech, and gratitude. I think there are about 20 different traits that Rabbi Salander and his students worked on. And what they would do was they would just do 4 things. It was a 4-part study. First, they would study texts related to the trait that they were learning and focus on 1 character trait per week. And during that week, they would try to keep track, like they would journal. And every time that came up for them, so let's see, if you're talking about trying to be more loving, so every time that you have a situation where maybe you could have been more loving, or maybe you were very loving, the idea is to track that, to see how you're doing with that trait. So first you learn some text, and then you track during the week sort of how you're feeling about that text, how you're encountering that text. The students also created small circles of friends. They would work in groups of 6, either in groups of 2, which is a chavruta, or they had groups of 6, and they evaluated each other. They gave feedback to each other on the trait that they were working on. And the 4th aspect is that they would choose a phrase, a sacred phrase, something from the Torah that had to do with the trait that they were working on. And the students would repeat the phrase over and over again, sort of like a mantra, and meditate on that phrase in order to internalize its message. So that's interesting. That's what also makes Mussar different, is that it has these 4 different components. You study a text, you sort of journal, and if you don't want to journal, practically, you can keep record of it in your mind. You work with other people, and you also say these sacred texts. And so the point of doing Mussar is that it takes a lot of awareness and effort to become a good person, even with the help of a good tradition, which we are fortunate to have. I'm thinking of one of my daughters had a teacher who was talking about, I don't think she was talking about Mussar, but she was talking about something else. And, where the students, they were in high school and they really had to work on something. And she was a Hebrew teacher because it was in day school. And she said to them, "Zelo holech hocus pocus." It doesn't happen hocus pocus. You have to put forth the effort. And conversely, without this effort, you can end up being observant and learned, but not being a good person. And I'm sure we've all encountered people like that, people who are very meticulous about the minutia of what they do, but when it comes to goodness and fairness and concern for others, they're just not there. So I know this was a very long introduction to what Mussar is and how it came to be and how it can inspire us to aspire to be our best selves. But you really need to learn what the process of Mussar is before you can learn to actually do Mussar. So today we're going to look at the trait called bitachon, and bitachon is Hebrew for trust. And I'm going to start with a nigun. I'm not going to sing it. We're going to watch a little video. The nigun is called hishtadlus. Hishtadlus is the Yiddish way of saying hishtadlut, which is Hebrew, which means effort. Remember when years ago Avis used to have a "We Try Harder" campaign? They actually had a button in Hebrew that said "Anu mishtadlim yoter." That's the same word. We try harder. So hishtadlut is effort and trying. So hishtadlus is the Yiddish way of saying it, and this nigun is supposed to represent the feeling of trying, the personal effort that goes into working on any trait. And effort is the balance between bitachon, right, which is the trust, which we're trying to do, and also and the effort that we have to put into it. And then this nigun is like a celebration of what it feels like to do that work, or at least that's what it attempts to do. It has a sort of a Native American beat to it, and the violinist is the daughter of a friend who I went to rabbinical school. So we'll only listen to about 2 minutes of it. It's longer, but I'm going to suggest that you sort of lean into it and try to feel it, maybe sway, and see if it reaches you or if it does anything for you. Someone to come in. I'm going to do this screen share. Screen share. That would be this. Share. It's right here. There we go. Ah, Mazel Tov. I found the new good. Okay. Anyway, so I was just wondering if anybody has any reactions to that. I really love that. I had heard it a while ago, and it just makes me feel it's the idea of like it makes you think about trust. I don't know. So I'm just wondering if anybody has any reactions to having heard that or seen that. Just unmute yourself.
I think you had to listen to it. It's Rita.
Hi.
For a few minutes before you got into the da 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 da. They weren't singing words. They were just
No words. That's what
Right.
what a nigun is. A nigun.
right. No words.
And
Yeah.
no words. It's just
So it wasn't the catchiest tune I've ever heard, but
I hear that.
I think I could get into it.
Okay. Anybody else? Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Rita. Anybody else?
It felt like a mantra, like I was just closing my eyes and kind of listening and thinking that if there was something I was trying to say, and like you talk about repeating things, it would be a good thing to do it too.
Right. Right. I felt that also. Anybody else have any thoughts on that or anything to share? Yeah, Sandy.
I liked it. The nigun, I think, was nice. I could have sat here and listened to it for a half hour. Once you get started, it gives you like as who was it? Rosalie said a mantra where you have an altered consciousness. What I don't understand is what do you mean by trust? Is it?
Oh well, we're gonna. Oh, you mean how does that represent trust?
How does trust make you a better person? I'm thinking of Charlie Brown trusting Lucy with the football every year, and he trusts her, and every year she picks the football up, and she and he says, well, this time I'll trust her, and it's never the trust is always betrayed. So how does that make you a better person?
So okay, so
for being
That's a perfect, so you're not a plant, Sandy, but this was perfect because I was now going to ask, we wanted to talk about trust. And I wanted to ask you to share, like, what comes to mind when I ask you, do you trust God? Or what does it mean for you to trust God? Or conversely, if you don't trust God, what does that mean for you if you're comfortable sharing that? And I would just like to hear from anybody's thoughts. There are no right and wrong answers. I'm not waiting for anyone to say something specific because there are no answers. This is totally subjective. So if I'm asking you, do you trust God, or what does it mean for you to trust God? Or if you don't trust God, why don't you trust God? Because what does that do for you? Anyone have anything to say, to share?
What do you mean by trusting God?
Well, I'm asking you, what would it mean to you?
Do you trust that God will prevent anything bad from happening to you? But bad things happen to everybody. So that can't mean that you trust God that nothing bad is going to happen. Does it mean that you trust God to always keep the world good and safe, but the world isn't good and safe? So what does it mean? You're trusting God for what? For being there and protecting you, but you're not always protected. So what does it mean to trust God? I don't understand what it means to trust God. I really don't.
Okay, good question. Thank you for posing that question. We will get to some of that. Anybody else?
Yes,
Letty, yes.
I want very much to trust God, but sometimes I feel now that I can't. And it scares me a little bit, because what we see, what Sandy just said, what we see going on, it just feels a little hopeless sometimes. And this makes me very sad because I really, really, really want to trust, but it's hard for me right now.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I certainly can understand that. Someone else? Rosalie.
I used to always feel that I trusted God because I felt there had to be something bigger than myself. So it can't be another human being. So for me, it was always, but granted, like Letty said, things don't always work out exactly the way you think they're going to work out. You can't just trust. I don't trust blindly, but I always feel that there has to be, for myself, that there has to be something bigger than myself. So that's my trust in God. But not blanketly, like, he's going to do everything for me exactly what I want, so.
Right. He's not your personal genie.
Exactly.
Right. Ronnie, yes. We have to unmute yourself, Ronnie.
I trust my God in that I think he has a plan. I don't know what the plan is. I don't think it'll always work out the way I want it to, but I think there is some kind, he has a plan that we don't really understand. And the outcome will sometimes be good and sometimes be bad, but I think there is some kind of plan.
Thank you. Beautiful, Ronnie. Anyone else have a thought on that? Okay, so you may have other things to say as we go along, and I really, really hope that you'll jump in if you do. I want to go to share. Oh, I keep going to end for a second. Okay, share screen. Share. Okay. Can I have someone read the third source here? Very short.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
R. Yosef Yozel Hurwitz.
Rabbi Yosef, yeah. He's the altar. He's the elder rabbi of.
Like an altar kaka, right?
Except he's an altar rebbe.
Okay.
But it is the same root of the same word. Yeah.
A person who tries to practice trust in God while leaving himself a backup plan is like a person who tries to learn how to swim but insists on keeping one foot on the ground. That's very good.
So this speaks to how hard it is to trust, right? I mean, Sandy was saying, everybody was saying that it's very hard to trust. And you sort of want to trust, but you don't want to trust. So so how do we do that? Like, how do we get ourselves to feel comfortable trusting? Bitachon, I just want to say, I don't know if you can say this, on this book called Everyday Holiness, which is a fabulous book by Alan Marinis, founder of the Mussar Institute. It's the Jewish spiritual path of Mussar. What I love about this book is it's a very deep book, but it's written very easily. You're not like gonna have to sit there and every time you read a sentence, you feel like you have to go back and read it 6 more times. It's written in very popular English. And he has all different kinds, all the traits that we were talking about. But he has a chapter, of course, he's got humility, patience, gratitude, compassion, equanimity, honor, simplicity, and just on and on. It's beautiful. And then, of course, he has one on trust. So you might find that book interesting if anybody's really interested to
Would
read
you
more
say
about
that
this.
title again?
Everyday Holiness.
And it's by
Everyday
whom?
Holiness by Alan Marinis. He's a cousin of Rick Marinis. I thought they were brothers, but they're not. Rick Marinis of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids fame. This is his cousin. So we don't want to live our lives with anxiety and worry, right? Nobody wants to live that way. And when we are in a place internally, when trust runs strong, when we have feeling trust, then somehow life feels more manageable. Okay. And when trust has slipped away and life feels more like a much more difficult struggle. And certainly in the last year and a half with the pandemic that we've had, it has been so hard. There has been so much anxiety and worry. I mean, it's starting to abate now, but it's still there. I mean, I'm going for my booster tomorrow. I know most of you have had your boosters already. We're vaccinated and we're still nervous. We're still anxious about it. And the idea that we couldn't trust our usual lives, like the rug was pulled out from under us. We didn't trust our usual lives. We couldn't trust in them. And that was huge. And that's what we've been living with, all this anxiety and worry. We don't want to live with that. Okay. So first, let me just be clear on the difference between faith and trust. Okay. Faith, emunah, which is a different trait, establishes that God is there, right? Belief in God, that God's presence is felt. But trust, what we're talking about today, bitachon, establishes something further, which I think it was Sandy who said it, that God responds to us, okay? Someone who trusts in God knows more than just that God is there, okay? They know God is there for me, meeting my concerns and responding to my needs, okay? So if you already believe in God, then trust in God will come more easily. But if you don't believe in God, then it'll be much more of a challenge. And the Rambam, Maimonides, actually talks about that, how faith and trust are two separate concepts, and that trust depends on faith, but faith exists by itself. Like you can have faith in God and not trust God, but you can't trust God and not believe that God doesn't exist, right? That wouldn't work. So having bitachon means that we trust God, that God will respond to us. So how do we do that? How do we trust in God? Sandy, that was your question. So part of that is, according to Mussar, is that bitachon, the trust, comes in 2 forms. One form is that one way we trust God is that we live our lives under the wing of God. Okay, that's one way. And the other way is that nothing happens to us by chance. So let's unpack those two ideas. And again, if you have any responses or anything you want to say, you can't throw tomatoes because we're on Zoom, but if you're feeling that this is triggering you in any way or push back, please feel free. So when we live our lives under the wing of God, this means that we believe that God will look out for us, right? When we're in an airplane, we trust that God is not going to let the plane fall from the sky. If we come to shul on Shabbat, which many of us have been doing recently, we trust that God will keep us safe from COVID while we're there. And there are so many things that we do on a daily basis where we trust that everything will be okay. Even going to sleep at night, we trust that God will wake us up, that we'll be able to wake up the next morning, right? So the trust is there on so many different things that we do. The classic story in the Torah about trust is the manna. When the Israelites were traveling through the desert for 40 years, They didn't have any food, right? There was no Stop and Shop or North Shore Farms. So God sent manna down to them miraculously every morning. And they would go out and they would collect the manna and they would eat it. And apparently it was this magic food that tasted like whatever you wanted it to taste like. And you could only collect enough for that day. In fact, if you didn't eat it and you left it over till the next day, it spoiled, it was rotten, you couldn't eat it. And this was their way that God was teaching the Israelites to trust. You just take as much as you needed for that day. You didn't take any more. The only exception was, of course, was for Shabbat. On Friday, you would collect what was called pishnayim, a double amount, that you'd have enough for Friday, and you'd have enough for Shabbat also. And that's how we get the custom of having 2 challahs on our table on Friday night. We have one for Friday night, and the other challah is for Shabbat afternoon. So,
Breaking up, Rabbi.
what?
I hear you. It's going bad. Your voice is going out.
Oh,
Great.
In and out.
I saw that they said the internet was unstable. Is it better now? Is that a little bit better?
We didn't hear you at all.
Now you can't hear me at all. Okay. Any suggestions? I'm sort of hoping it'll come back miraculously. Is it coming back?
Seems
Okay.
okay.
It sounds,
It's
I
okay.
can hear you.
It's okay
Now I
now?
can hear you.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'm gonna
you.
I'm gonna lead with trust and hope that this is gonna be okay for the rest of the class. The great Mussar master, the altar of Novaradak, who we just read about, who just had that quote about, you can't swim and keep one leg on the floor, on the ground. He was so radical about putting trust in God that every year when he had new
We just
students,
lost you again.
There's an indication that your bandwidth, Rabbi, is low. That's
the
why. we're
bandwidth is
experiencing
low.
the problem.
Okay, it must
That's what it says on the screen.
on the screen. Are you
Now,
hearing?
now
me?
you're muted. Now
Right.
you're muted.
Now I'm muted, or you can hear me? Can you hear me?
Now we can.
I
hear
can
you.
hear.
Okay.
I-
So
I
the
can hear
Alter Rebbe, he used to send his students 200 miles from the yeshiva with a one-way train ticket and tell them to find their way back. That is how he taught them to learn to trust and to not fear. So bitachon, okay, this idea of not having fear, the idea is that the heart is hard for the heart to hold both fear and trust at the same time. Okay, when you cultivate trust in our lives, we loosen the grip of fear on our hearts. So think about someone in your life who you truly trust, right? When you trust someone and you know that they're not going to hurt you and they have your best interest at heart, then that you don't have any fear of that person. You trust that person. There's no fear. And love presupposes that trust, right? In order to love someone, we have to trust them and trust that they're going to care about us. And only when we trust someone can we also love them. And it's the same with God. By trusting God, we can come to love God, v'ahavta. So the students of Mussar, bitachon, they felt that bitachon means that we respect that whatever is happening in our lives, I think Ronnie said this, that this is part of the curriculum that God has planned for us. God stretches us and God pulls us, sometimes through love and sometimes with blows, but that's what helps us grow in ways that we otherwise would never grow. We wouldn't be who we are today if we didn't have to encounter all the vicissitudes in our lives. Okay, if life has been easy, right? If God was the genie that made everything perfect and we didn't have challenges, that would sort of be a little bit. Life probably would be a little bit boring. On one hand, yeah, we say we would like a life like that, but I'm not so sure how we would feel about that. And that's what it means to live under the wing of God, to have trust. We trust our daily lives will be lived with God's protection on a daily basis. And that is actually the basis for the theme for Psalm 23, right? Let's take a quick look at the most popular of all the Psalms, Psalm 23. Letty, you want to read that? Because I know you love Psalm 23.
A Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. God causes me to lie down in green pastures. God leads me beside the still waters. God restoreth my soul. God guides me in straight paths for the sake of God's name. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup is overflowing. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Right. It's that verse 4. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you, God, are with me. This is the ultimate trust. This the psalmist, whoever wrote this, some say it was King David, others say it could have been someone else, that is the ultimate trust. The second way, so that's one way to see that we're living under the wing of God, that God is protecting us. Another way that we have bitachon, that we can have trust, is understanding that nothing happens by chance. The idea that behind this is that we accept whatever happens to us because we understand that there's a reason and order in the world, even though we don't understand that reason and that order. We don't understand it, we can't comprehend it, but we think and we have trust that there's a reason why everything happens. How often has something bad or negative happened to you, and only much later in hindsight can you think, that was the best thing that ever could have happened to me? Some people say that when they get fired from a job. Some people say that when they leave a bad relationship, I have a friend, a very dear friend. We're friends since we're 14 years old. And her father died when she was in her 20s. And she told me only years later, she said, if her father hadn't died, she never would have been able to get married because she was very close to her dad and she was not able to get close to another man. So it was only because her father died that she was able to move on with her life and get married. And interesting, she's married now to the same wonderful man for 35 years, and her daughter is actually getting married next week. So if things happen for a reason, even if we can't understand the reason, then practically speaking, part of trust, part of bitachon is letting go of fear, letting go of its uncertainty, letting go of the anxiety, and letting go of the control, and letting go of the planning. And that is really not easy to do, because bitachon, that kind of trust, is letting go of something larger that I can't name or I can't know. I want to share my screen again.
Your sound is breaking up.
Sound is breaking up. Is it a little bit better?
We can hear you now, but
You
we
can
can
hear
hear
me.
you.
Okay, so it's back and forth. I'll do some sort of somersaults to make sure that this doesn't happen next week. I apologize. So here are some questions to think about that may help you develop bitachon, to be able to trust more, okay? The first is, what am I holding tightly to that I need to drop, or at least hold less tightly? Opinions that I'm holding, certainties that I have, pieces of my own self-image, images I hold of other people. If I were to let go of those, some of those, would that help me trust more? Okay. What would that feel like for me? What have I been holding tightly that I should let go of and let flow into my bitachon, into my trust? Okay. Resistance and fear come up when we think about letting something go. Resistance lies at the core of what inhibits our bitachon, right? We're resistant to trusting. We want to trust. I think Letty said that we want to trust, but we can't for whatever reason. So how can I release myself from resistance, and how can I let go of things that I can't control in order to enhance my feelings of security? This is all part of the work of Mussar. This one trait of trusting. These are some of the things that we can work on, that we can read sacred phrases about, that we can meditate on, that we can keep a journal about. These are the things. This is the actual work of bitachon, of doing the Mussar. So we can either succumb to fear and anxiety, especially over things we have no control over, or we can, as they say, give it to God and trust God's judgment, even though we can't understand it. This is actually, I learned this recently, that's the third step in a 12-step program, giving it over to God, placing it in God's hands, and knowing that we don't have the control over it. In Mishle, in Proverbs 3:5, it teaches us, don't rely on your own understanding. Don't be arrogant and think that you get it, because you don't get it. We don't get it. We never really know the full picture, which is why we can't understand it. There's a beautiful story, again, from the Chafetz Chaim. And I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to ask somebody to read this story for us. A volunteer, please. Who would like to read this?
I'll read it
Thank you, Sandy.
if I can see it with these glasses. A story attributed to the Hovetz Chaim. A man was once visiting a small town. As it was Shabbat morning, he went to the local synagogue where everything was just as you might expect, until unusual things started happening. There were well-dressed, obviously prosperous people seated near the front, but all the honors for the Torah reading were given to scruffy men who stood clustered at the back of the room. When it came time for the rabbi to say a few words of wisdom, all he spoke about was the weather. After the prayers were finished, lovely food was spread on the table, and nobody ate. The man was flummoxed. What kind of place was this? Finally, he pulled aside one of the locals and asked, "What's going on here?" The men who got the Torah honors, the rabbi's talk, the uneaten food, nothing makes any sense. The man explained. Those scruffy-looking men had been unjustly imprisoned, and the community worked long and hard to ransom them to freedom. Isn't it wonderful that they are now free to come to bless the Torah? The rabbi spoke only about the weather because there has been an unusual drought this season, and the farmers have nothing on their minds but their crops. And the rabbi knew and cared for their concern. Why didn't anyone eat? One Shabbos every month, the community prepares its usual lunch, but instead of eating it, the food is donated to the local home for the elderly. I can see how it might have looked to you, the local man told the guest. But when you can see only part of the picture, it's easy to put together the wrong impressions of what is going on. This is a parable for our own lives, since at every moment you can see only part of the situation, then you can't possibly know what is really going on. That will be revealed only in the fullness of time. In the meantime, though, your task is to trust. And at times, it can be an enormous challenge when the burden of life itself is enormous.
So I love this story. Thank you, Sandy. I love this story because it so illustrates that we don't know, we never really know what's going on. We think we know what's going on. We think we do because we're intelligent and, you know, we're evolved and whatever. And we think we know what's going on. There's a fabulous book by Maury Album, who the guy who wrote Tuesdays with Maury. He wrote a book called The 5 People You Meet in Heaven. It's a short little book, like all the Maury Album books, the Mitch Album books are. And
We
I'm
lost
not,
you again.
what? They lost me again.
You broke up, but I think you might be back now.
Okay, am I back
You're
now?
muted.
Okay, I'm muted. No, I'm not muted.
I went.
Anyway, so this book it's a wonderful book. It's called The 5 People You Meet in Heaven. And I'm not giving anything away, because on the very first page, you find out that the protagonist, he has 50 minutes to live. Okay, and it tells you about, you know, what happens when he has 40. He doesn't know this, but he's got 45 minutes to live, 40 minutes. He's got 5 minutes to live. He's killed in an accident. He works in an amusement park. Anyway, he gets to heaven and he meets 5 different people who explain to him what his life was all about. Like, and that's almost like a Rube Goldberg thing. You know, remember when that happened? Well, that happened because of that, and that's why that happened. And it's a brilliant, the book is really basically a brilliant midrash on exactly this idea of this bitachon, of this trusting, of not knowing what's going on or thinking we know what's going on, but we really don't have any clue what's going on. So the bitachon, the trusting that everything happens for a reason and that God will watch out for me, doesn't entitle us, of course, to like cross the street without looking or to walk in front of a bus, right? According to the Torah, we're supposed to do everything we can to keep ourselves from potential harm. Exposing ourselves to danger is not trust in God, that's reckless, okay? One of the Mussar teachers, the Chazon Ish, says that bitachon doesn't mean trusting that we will always be safe. Rather, it means that if we are hurt, there's a meaning and purpose to it. That's a really hard thing to lean into. Doesn't mean that trust means that God will only make sure that we're safe. It means that there's a purpose behind it if we're not. And this means that understanding all the secrets of the universe is beyond our comprehension. But that when we walk through the particular fires that we're given, like in Psalm 23, you're not hearing me? God will be there to provide healing. Okay, I'm almost done. Can you hear me now? Because I'll finish. I'll wrap this up. Can you hear me? Sorta. Yes, no? Yes, okay. So hopefully from today, you get why we say that we don't learn Mussar, we do Mussar, right? Mussar is work. We have to work on building our trust in God or whatever the other trait is that what we're working on. When we experience fear and anxiety, that's a sign that we're not trusting God and that we need to look inside ourselves and find what's blocking the trust. Why are we resistant to trusting? And why is bitachon? Why is trust so hard for us? So maybe after this class, you might feel compelled to work on trust, or maybe you'll say one of the sacred phrases, or you'll think about a phrase that holds meaning for you, or maybe you'll try journaling. And when you feel you have trust, or when you feel you don't have trust, and that's the real practice of bitachon. Try it for a week and see what happens. And so let's just look. I just wanted to look at a couple of screen share, a couple of verses that you might want to say if you were so inclined. Phrases to repeat and meditate and focus on. Okay, so the first one, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
The first one is from Havdalah, right? Hinei el Yeshuati. This is, behold the God who gives me triumph. I am confident, unafraid, for God is my strength and my might, and God has been my deliverance. And the idea is that you pick a phrase and you say it over and over and over until you actually believe it or feel it. Another one is from Isaiah, trust in God forever and ever, for an Adonai you have an everlasting rock. The High Holy Day Psalm that we say from Rosh Chodesh Elul until Shmini Atzeret, though my father and my mother abandon me, God will gather me in. And from Psalms 32, many are the torments of the wicked, but the one who trusts in God will be surrounded with love. And also from Psalms, happy is the person who trusts in you, God. So my prayer is that we all find a way to have bitachon, to have trust, to develop the trust we need in order to let go so we can live our lives with less fear and less anxiety and give it to God. And let us say amen.
Amen.
I would love to hear anybody's responses or reactions or ideas or things that they might feel that they might take away from this.
I just have to say that some very terrible things have happened to me during the past year, horrible things, and I trying to believe that there's a reason for everything. Nevertheless, it's very difficult. Because if a couple of very bad things happen and you don't know why, it's very hard not to fear that something else very bad is going to happen too, even though you can't see the whole picture. When I studied many years ago, I studied to be a counselor, and we did practice exercises in order to trust people, to try to trust people. One of the exercises was somebody would stand behind you and you had to let yourself fall back and trust that they would catch you. Now, if they catch you, this gives you extra reason to trust. But if you fall on your back,
what's the point?
it's going to be very, very hard to say, well, there was a reason for my suffering this pain. I was supposed to, why this had to happen. It was supposed to happen, although I can't see why. But when you're suffering, it's very difficult to say, there's a reason for this, and I can trust that, it's nothing else bad is going to happen, because you don't know.
That's true. That you're
Right.
right. I can't argue with you, Sandy. You've had a very difficult year. I know that. And just because we say that there could be reasons for it, it's still hard. It's very hard to trust. Very hard to trust. That's why it's real work.
I would like to change the conversation slightly.
Sure.
So you gave the example of that person who goes up an airplane and trusts that God is going to keep the airplane in the air. I don't think about it that. I think that we have engineers, pilots, and these people are the ones that we trust to keep that airplane going. Now, where did they get their skills? Where their talents come from? We can say those came from God. They were given to, look at medicine. Just look at surgery. I don't think that I'm going to trust in God. I think I'm trusting the surgeon. Where did all the advances in modern medicine come from? They came from people who had God-given talents. So I think we should maybe take a step back and think about trusting in people. And in the back of that is, where are the people getting the skills and the talents?
Right. I thank you for
sharing.
sharing.
It's easier to say, I have to learn how to trust other people than it is to say, I have to learn how to trust God, because that's very difficult.
I'm saying, well, maybe there's a connection between the two. Maybe the idea is of trusting God, that God will provide the surgeon who can do what has to be done, or God will provide the medication. Not that God will do it. Clearly the pilot flies the plane, but that God will provide this pilot with the knowledge that he or she needs to actually fly that plane safely and get you home safely. The same thing with the surgeon. That could be one way of looking at that. It's that it's like not God magically, flying the plane through the air, but that God works. That's saying we don't understand the picture. So maybe it's that God is giving we trust that God is giving to the right persons the right skills to carry us through what it is, possibly.
And also that I'm a terrible flyer, and also that we are getting that pilot that has all the best skills that God gave to him. And that's how I always look at it, as always I'm looking at, I trust that God, and it's not that God's flying the plane for me, and I also want him to bring another pilot that's sitting next to me in the seat. So that's a joke.
As my mother always likes to say, she says, the pilot wants to see his family tonight also.
Exactly.
But it's not, that's why Mussar is work. That's why these traits are work. I started with trust because that's probably one of the more difficult ones, but they all require work. That's the difference about Mussar. You don't just, you can study it, but you have to work at it in order for it to mean anything to you, and for order for it to be assimilated into your modus vivendi every day. Any other thoughts?
To me, it's very amazing how there are people that can trust. I grew up in a Holocaust family with a lot of friends in that family, and you watch them go through and have children, and they trust in God. And you would think that it would be the opposite. You'd have to go trust something else, because you couldn't trust that a God would actually do something like that to people. And I never really understood that. I know, because I was listening to Sandy with that exercise she did, because I also went to social work school, and they did the same exercise, and I never let myself fall. I couldn't do it. I could not let myself even go back, not even thinking that the person would, or my own trust wouldn't let me do it. So I think everybody's different in different ways, but I take these people that actually went through the Holocaust and can trust, and it's unbelievable to me.
Right.
Sometimes.
The fact that they would marry and have children, more people to love, after having lost who they've lost, it's amazing. I agree.
Right. And that belief in God on top of that, it's not just that they had the family and then said, well, I'm giving up God, I'm going to have my family and just trust them. They still had that big faith in God, and it always amazed me. So.
Right. I knew one man who said that he would never, ever forgive God for the Holocaust, but he still put on tefillin every day.
Right. That's beautiful.
Right, there were people that. You can
Oh,
speak.
you can-
You know,
My
there's a-
wingman, my techno wingman.
And there were people.
There's a poem.
There were men in the camps that hid the tefillin and put it on the tefillin as much as they could. Right? So you never know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
There
very-
is a poem, unfortunately, I don't have a copy of it here, that someone wrote about how these old men who had gone through the Holocaust sit around and they're judging God, what the terrible thing that God did. And at the end of the discussion, the poem says, oh, it's time for the evening prayers now, which it's very, very interesting. Viktor Frankl was he was a famous psychiatrist who developed a system of psychotherapy. And he went through the Holocaust. He lost his first wife. His wife had sewn in, he had written this magnum opus of his theory, and she had sewn it into his coat. So the Nazis wouldn't get it. So when they came to arrest him, they of course made him take off their coats, and some of the people were given the gas showers, and other ones survived. He survived. He was a doctor, and he was strong, so he managed to survive. And but he had to take off his clothes. You had to take your coat, and then afterwards you took somebody else's coat. There was no way he could find his coat again. And he was devastated because all this writing had been sewn in his coat and it was lost. And so he had to put on somebody else's coat, probably somebody who had died, who had gone through the gas chamber. So he put on this other coat and he put his hand in the pocket. And in the pocket was written the Shema. He wasn't observant, but the Shema was written in his pocket. And he kept that for the whole time that he was there. And then afterwards, he continued to write, and he lived a very long, meaningful life. But I always thought that was a beautiful story, that happened. And he was able to survive everything, and he was able to go through it. Man's Search for Meaning, I think is his.
Yes, that's his book. Yeah, logotherapy. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. Yeah, I used to interview Holocaust survivors as part of the Spielberg Survivors of the Shoah Foundation, and I was always astounded at how they could, at the trust that they had, that the belief and the trust that they had in God. Any other? I don't want to. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you so much. Next week, we're talking about patience, which is easier and harder at the same time, because I think that patience also affects our lives all the time. And I think a lot of us have to, we want to be patient, and so we'll see what Mussar has to teach us about patience.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Good night.
Thank you, Yashikar.
Thank you.
Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. If I could find it. Find it here. Stop it right here.
Let's stay on.